Hello, in this video I want to analyze Jordan Peterson's critique of Hitler. Okay, so let's start.
So here's what you should have done if you were a Nazi and you wanted to win the war. You should have enslaved the Jews and the Gypsies and had them work, right? You should have had them work for the benefit of the victory, and then if you wanted to, you liquidate them afterwards. That's the logical thing to do if you want to win. And we assume that Hitler wanted to win. But that's not a very intelligent assumption. Why would you assume that? He wasn't exactly a good guy. So why should we assume that he was aiming at the good that he was promoting, even in his own terms, right? The glorious, everlasting Third Reich, right? That'll rule for 1,000 years and be a bastion of civilization and music, because that's the sort of thing he purported to be interested in. Well, so what do you do with the Jews and the Gypsies? Well, round them up, fine. Enslave them, fine. You don't kill them. You certainly don't devote a substantial proportion of your war resources while you're losing to accelerate the rate at which the extermination is taking place, because that's a bit counterproductive, unless what you're aiming at is the maximum possible mayhem in the shortest period of time. Well, so what?
Okay. So he makes a point that's actually interesting. That's the same point that's made by Overy in his book The Dictators. So what was truly crazy about Hitler was that Hitler did kill his own workforce. For example, the Jews, the Gypsies, the gay people. So yeah, it is true. Hitler did kill part of his own workforce that could have been used as slave labor, although many Jews did die while working as slaves simply from starvation. So Hitler was also trying to save food for his people, as he saw them, for the Aryan people, and that's why he didn't give the Jews and the Gypsies much food in the work camps. And also one thing that actually makes Hitler worse, much worse than the Soviets and Stalin, in my opinion, and I'm not sure if Dr. Peterson knows about this, but so people often compare what Stalin did to the kulaks, to the rich peasants in the Soviet Union. He ended up killing somewhere around 3 million of them, with what happened in Nazi Germany with the Jews and other groups. But the main difference is that Stalin didn't have death camps for the kulaks. So the kulaks mostly died either as a result of lack of food in the Soviet Union. Some of them were killed, but very few, less than 100,000 were directly killed by the Soviet state, and many died during peasant rebellions because they just refused to just hand over all their property to the state without putting up a fight. But they mostly died as a result of massive famines, or as a combination of this weird indifference and discrimination of the Soviet state towards them. So the kulaks were transported to the Far East often and just left there to work on the land, and the Soviets never even checked what's happening with them. And Solzhenitsyn brings us this truly bizarre story of a small kulak village being discovered in the 1950s by the Red Army, and then they were accused of sabotage. But the fact that they were allowed to exist, that the Soviet state was so indifferent towards them, is I would argue, what makes the Soviet program of extermination a much different thing from Hitler's program of extermination, and a lack of fanaticism when compared to Hitler, I would argue, was present in the Soviet Union. So yeah, Hitler truly was cartoonishly evil when it comes to the Jews. He even said that when he wins the war with the United States, he will ask them to give all the Jews to him. He wanted to kill even all the American Jews. But okay, so my main point of disagreement with Jordan Peterson is that Hitler didn't truly want to win. No, Hitler, I would argue, had two, to an extent, contradictory goals. On the one hand, he wanted to win. On the other hand, he wanted to exterminate the Jews because, in his opinion, all Jews were spreading Bolshevism in order to control the world. And then also Hitler claimed that the Bolsheviks and the Jews betrayed Germany in the First World War. So in his mind, he was making sure that Jews were unable to betray his country in the future. And he also famously said that at least he will be remembered as a guy that exterminated all the Jews in Europe. So he said it in 1945 in the context of his empire collapsing and just being wiped out on the battlefield. And yeah, he saw himself as a hero saving the Western civilization from the Jews. But yeah, so people often actually have contradictory goals. So that's not something that's so unique to Hitler. I mean, for example, the Soviets wanted to, at the same time, to fight colonialism and go to space, but at the same time they wanted to provide their people with better housing. So those were contradictory goals insofar as they didn't have money to do both things at the same time, and that's why there was a lack of living space in the Soviet cities. But okay, let us continue.
What happened as the Germans started to lose the war? Did Hitler lose faith in his own ability? No, he believed that the Germans had betrayed him with weakness, and so he was perfectly willing to accelerate the rate at which Germany was losing the war. And so when Hitler and his minions had the choice, here's the choice. You can suspend your unnecessary demolition of people, win the damn war, and then pick it up afterwards, or while you're losing, you can just accelerate the mayhem even though it's counterproductive. It's like, what'd they pick? Well, they picked to accelerate the mayhem. And so to me, there's an old psychoanalytic idea. I think this was derived by Jung. If you can't figure out what someone is doing or why, look at the outcome and infer the motivation. If it produces mayhem, perhaps it was aiming at mayhem. Now, you have to use that dictum carefully. If someone's irritating you, maybe it's because you're irritable and you should sort yourself out, but maybe it's because they're actually aiming at irritating you. And that's the actual motivation. So perhaps not, but it's another tool in your analytical armament. So, and so you see, well, and this is the thing about warfare that's so interesting about because you can attribute it to territoriality. You can attribute it to a war for resources. That's what I would say, wretchedly simple-minded economists presume. People fight over scarce resources. It's like, hey, we're a little bit more sophisticated than that. And first of all, what resources are you talking about? The bloody Inuit had nothing. They lived perfectly well. What did they have? Snow and seal blubber.
Okay, what needs to be said is that the Germans weren't Inuits. The German economy wasn't the economy of the just of the Inuits. It was a very developed economy, one of the most developed economies in Europe, and Hitler's war machine needed oil. And Henry Kissinger, I would argue, one of the best historians of the 20th century, so we can put his foreign policy on the side. I don't agree with his foreign policy, but with some things I agree, but I mostly don't. But he's a brilliant historian, and he argues in his book History of Diplomacy, one of the best books, one of the best historical books that I read, is that one of the main reasons for Hitler attacking the Soviet Union was that he wanted to capture the oil fields in the Caucasus. And with the oil, with the Soviet oil, Hitler would, according to him, be truly unstoppable, and the rest of the world would be on the menu for Hitler. He did want world domination, which is one of the things that makes him cartoonishly evil, and even, I would argue, much more evil than Stalin, who didn't want world domination. He just wanted to have his communist sphere of influence. But Kissinger also asks an interesting question. He analyzes the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and he asks, how were these two ideologies that hate each other and want to wipe each other from the face of the earth, how come they were able to make a pact, or at least for a while to make a pact, a very short while, but still for a year and a half. And he argues, well, the German economy at the time desperately needed Soviet oil, while the Soviet economy at the time desperately needed German machinery in order to make their economy more developed. And so he argues that at multiple times in history the economy is shown to be more important than ideology, which is what Dr. Peterson doesn't really understand. And he argues, as many other historians, that the Crusades could be described actually as a mostly economic conflict. Why is that? Okay, here's why. Try and guess which feudal lords were the most likely demographic to go on a crusade. The feudal lords that had nothing to inherit from their fathers. So older brothers would get the land, and then younger brothers kind of found themselves in a situation where they had no land to inherit, and they decided to go on a crusade and conquer their own kingdoms. So yeah, I think Peterson here just forgets how important resources are to humanity and to the German war machine at the time.
You know, people can live in unbelievably deprived conditions. And so the idea that there are natural resources that we fight over because there's a shortage of them is a pretty oversimplified view of human beings. It's like, well, why do people fight? Well, maybe they fight sometimes for good reasons, but very, very frequently they fight for bad reasons. And those bad reasons are personal as well as sociocultural and economic. You know, if you were a Nazi prison guard, for example, whatever pathologies you were carrying around in your destructive little soul, whatever element of Cain was deeply embedded in you, had the opportunity to be manifest fully at every moment of your waking existence, right? You had these people who were completely beholden to you, with no rights whatsoever, to whom you could do whatever your evil little heart determined. You think, well, maybe that was a motivation for putting them there to begin with. And all the cover story about, well, we're trying to build the Third Reich and we're trying to stabilize the state and we're trying to do all these good things. Maybe that's just a cover story for the real motivation, which is nothing but what? The construction of death camps that killed 6 million people. How about that? And the obliteration of 120 million people on the planet, and the leaving of Europe in ruins. Maybe that was the motivation. Or are we going to attribute to Hitler the highest possible motives? Say, no, it's an archetypal manifestation of Cain. Now, he's going to put up a front that says, well, I'm your savior. It's like, well, destructive people think that Cain is their savior.
Okay, what I just want to mention is Hitler in Mein Kampf actually has a chapter about how much he hates the Marxists. He actually uses the term the Marxists, and he talks about how he wants to wipe out the communists from the face of the earth. And why would, just let us ask a very obvious question, why would Hitler lie at the time? So he wrote the book while he was still mostly an irrelevant person. He was in jail, and I mean, this idea that Hitler was a Joker-like figure that just wanted to cause as much chaos as possible, where, well, I disagree. No, he talked about how much he hates the communists and the Jews, and then he attacked the Soviet Union. And yeah, and we can see that it wasn't just random chaos and bloodshed that Hitler committed. For example, he was much more brutal towards the Slavic nations in the east than towards the French, because he saw French, at least the white French people, as superior, and he treated them better. French prisoners had much higher rate of survival than Soviet prisoners, for example. So yeah, I really disagree with this idea that Hitler just wanted to create chaos. And pretty much all respected historians such as Overy, Henry Kissinger, pretty much Isaac Deutscher, pretty much all of them agree that Hitler was a true believer in fascism. But okay, that's all for today.